May 1st, 1893, Chicago. Opening night of the World's Fair. 100,000 people gather to take part in celebration of not only the future, but also the 400-year anniversary of Christopher Columbus's so-called discovery of America. The fairgrounds are massive, opulent, a culmination of 3 years of construction and planning. Each building neoclassical in style, painted white for the optimal sense of immersion. Up until this time in history, human beings were left to work and in some instances thrive based on the rising and setting of the sun. The dependency on oil lamps and firelight had become a normal way of life, and to exist without it would leave the world in the Stone Age. But on this day, all of that was rumored to change. As dusk fell upon the venue, the swarm of people surrounded a large landing where President Grover Cleveland stood and gave a short speech about the era to come. Anticipation grew, and as he pressed down on a large button prepared at his side, the entire venue, fitted with over 160,000 light bulbs, sprang to life. Gasps and applause filled the grounds. A new era had been achieved, and the only question that remained was who would take responsibility. Not only were those in attendance privy to the new inventions such as electric sewing machines, electric irons, even an early version of the fax machine, they were also privy to the hard work and ingenuity of its 37-year-old inventor, Nikola Tesla, and his alternating current method of electric power. To some, this was a new and gigantic step past the hardships and obstacles faced by our ancestors. But to Nikola Tesla, this was simply an outward expression of a detailed reality that he had held within his mind since childhood. Welcome to the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast, episode 15. Thank you for joining me for the 15th episode of the pod. Today, we'll take a brief look at the life and times of one Nikola Tesla. Most of you have heard of him. Some of you may even drive the electric vehicle which bears his name. But on this episode, I'd like to talk about not only the obvious genius Tesla possessed, but also the idea that possibly some of the same gifts that he was handed down genetically may have been a professional curse in the long run. To begin, Nikola Tesla was born on July 10th, 1856, in Smiljan, Croatia. His father, Milutin, was a priest, and his mother, Juka, who although illiterate, was brilliant in her own right, served as a housemaker. On the day of his birth, there was an omen which would ironically link him to his destiny. A lightning storm, violent and constant, raged through the night, almost lighting his way into the world. At the time, lightning was seen as a sign of darkness coming to the world. The doula who helped his mother give birth was the first to point that out. But his mother, Juka, believing the opposite, put a stop to that tradition, immediately reversing the superstition by saying her child would be a child of light. Juka was somewhat of a genius herself. A natural knack for engineering, she could easily take apart household appliances and enhance them to make them better, more efficient, even constructing tools if needed. She also had an eidetic memory, meaning she had the ability to hear or see almost anything and recite even the most minute or complex detail with 100% accuracy. Whether that be a song, a book passage or poem, even the intricate mechanisms of a device, a gift which she would pass down to the young Tesla. The fourth of 5 children, Tesla grew up relatively happy. Due to his father's vocation as a priest and teacher, the family had an existence of relative peace and understanding of humanity, Ambitions of wealth and power were rarely, if ever, discussed, and based on the examples before him, Tesla never saw money to be a thing of great importance. To him, it was a means to an end, never a goal. At the age of 5, an event which would permanently alter his course in life, as well as his mental state, occurred. When Dane, his older brother, was killed in a tragic horse accident right before the eyes of Nikola. From that moment on, he would see visions, sometimes odd, other times informative, that, according to him, allowed him to compartmentalize a situation and within his mind see the desired outcome, a skill he would use and suffer from for the rest of his life. By the age of 17, while enrolled in seminary school, he was struck with cholera and bedridden for 9 months. During this time, he began to focus on what he really wanted to do in life, and that was electrical engineering. His father, although disappointed, promised Tesla that if he survived his bout with the disease, he had his full permission to seek a life of his choosing, and that he did. Immediately upon release from hospital, Tesla enrolled in Austria Polytechnic School in Graz, the premier school for electrical engineering at the time. The young Tesla thrived, studying a staggering 20 hours a day and taking twice the amount of exams needed. This was despite an occasional mental breakdown and newly developed phobias of germs, hair, and for some reason, the sight of pearls on a woman's neck. He was such a germaphobe that he couldn't eat without wiping his hands continuously, using up to 20 napkins per meal. By the second year, things began to go south. Tesla became a gambler, an addiction so severe that not only was all of his money used for the vice, but by the time the tuition payment came due, he simply didn't have it. The hard-earned money given to him lost gambling chess games in local pubs and on-campus wagers. Ashamed, Tesla fled to Budapest, where he worked as a draftsman and electrician until 1881. It was around this time that one of his visions appeared to him while walking in the park with a friend. In it, he saw a completed version of a new invention, the AC conductor motor. He attempted to explain it to the friend, but after realizing the newness of the idea couldn't be expressed with simple words, he grabbed a stick and drew out the entire design in the dirt from memory. As luck would have it, Tesla found work at the newly developed Paris branch of the Edison company. Due to his brilliance and confidence, he was recommended to work directly under Thomas Edison in New York. Eager to expand his knowledge and perhaps persuade Edison from his dependence on direct or DC current, a method of electric transfer which Tesla saw as inferior, he jumped at the chance. By 1884, when Tesla arrived in New York by way of steamship, he was traumatized and broke. This was by no fault of his own. There was a mutiny on the ship, and he was robbed of everything he had save for his clothes and a few books. With 4 cents in his pocket, Tesla immediately went to Edison, where they conversed about theory and the work he'd done in Paris. Impressed, Edison hired him on the spot, and a productive yet oftentimes volatile relationship began. To put it plainly, AC, or alternating current, can move in one direction and in reverse. This makes it suitable for power lines and high voltage usage, but more dangerous and prone to fires and explosion without or with the transformer, but more versatile than DC, or direct current, which is primarily used for home appliances and devices due to its more predictable nature. This is where the two had the greatest conflict. But unlike Tesla, who had no real business or marketing mind due to partially his upbringing, Edison had the gift of gab and showmanship, which made him not only rich, but influential. Nevertheless, 6 months later, Tesla left the company and found himself digging ditches for $2 a day to make ends meet. Within a year, Tesla managed to find investors willing to front the cost for the AC revolution. But within another year, the project was abandoned due to cold feet. Luckily, 2 more investors came on board, and the Tesla Electric Company was formed, followed by a lucrative partnership with George Westinghouse Electric, based out of Pittsburgh, a competitor of Edison, which not only believed in Tesla, but also gave him shares of the company and a hefty signing bonus equaling $75,000, roughly $2.5 million in today's money, plus a profit-sharing package where Tesla would receive $2.50 for every horsepower of electricity sold, a deal which would easily make him a billionaire by middle age if all went according to plan. This partnership became legendary by 1893, culminating at the Chicago's World Fair. After the display of light illuminated the fairgrounds, the possibilities became endless. Tesla's AC revolution would be the standard, and all he had to do was show and prove. But Thomas Edison had other plans. Almost immediately, he began to poison the well, planting news stories and holding public exhibitions of the dangers of alternating current in everyday use, even going as far as to use the technology to electrocute a live elephant. By the time Edison was done, the general public believed that the only real use for AC was for the execution of prisoners by electric chair, a use which Edison championed. By this time, Tesla's alternating current was proven, used to power Buffalo, New York by harnessing the power of the Niagara Falls. But slowly, the deals began to run dry, and his once healthy partnership with Westinghouse Electric began to sour. One afternoon, while meeting with George Westinghouse, a conversation about the company's financials came up. George explained that the company was under heavy financial strain and that their commitment to pay the exorbitant amount owed to him, along with his profit-sharing incentive, was starting to become too much to bear. Tesla, not having a business mind and not possessing the ability to negotiate, let alone see the value of money, tore up his contract, assuring George that AC was more important to him than money and that eventually all would sort itself out. That was not the case, and within months, Tesla found himself unemployed, broke, and seeking another investor. It was around that time that another more powerful method of electric current came to him. This time it was the Tesla coil, a device so powerful that it could be used wirelessly. If done properly, light bulbs, appliances, even entire buildings could be electrified without the use of wires and plugs. This attracted a $150,000 investment by J.P. Morgan, which funded the construction of the first Tesla tower and coil. But due to delays and fires and the increasing amount of money required for R&D, J.P. pulled out, leaving Tesla no other option but to demolish the tower and sell the scrap metal to pay off his debts. From then on, Tesla became somewhat of a recluse, never to marry, fearing that the women of his time had grown too masculine in their pursuits and a waste of time and effort. As he aged, Tesla would hop from hotel to hotel in New York City, sometimes leaving without paying the bill. Often he would be seen feeding pigeons in the park and staring into nothingness. Occasionally, he would conduct small press junkets where he would pontificate about the future of electricity and the ignorance of Einstein and his so-called theory of relativity and the ridiculous notion of splitting the atom. In retrospect, he was very, very wrong. And these press conferences slowly became a way to humor a man who had slowly drifted into schizophrenia and obsessive-compulsive disorder, diagnoses which did not exist at that time. All this came to an end when a housekeeper found his dead body after noticing his "Do Not Disturb" sign lingering over the doorknob for 2 days straight. The date was January 7th, 1943. As fate would have it, Tesla died a mainly forgotten relic of the past. Over time, his genius and true importance and usage of AC power has been recognized as one of, if not the greatest steps forward in human history. His intellect and memory was a genetic gift passed down from mother to son, which served him and humanity to the highest degree. But it was the things that were not gifted, business savvy, self-preservation, and wisdom, which ultimately became his downfall. Thank you for returning. Well, it's the second half of the episode where we bring forward a story which I believe somehow relates to the ultimate theme of the episode. Today, we're going to journey into something a little bit personal, but in a sense, it definitely does connect with today's episode. It's a short story, primarily an essay, that I call Soul Food for Thought. To begin, a close second to God, food was my mother's religion. As a child, holiday mornings and special occasions were drenched with the smell of onions and bouillon boiling in large stock pots filled with items I was too short to see, but old enough to anticipate. The stovetop, which lay dormant and brooding the night before, was now alive with grease crackling and wooden utensils stirring and flipping some of the greatest concoctions I had ever known. Collard greens, macaroni and cheese, ham, turkey, dressing, cranberry sauce, on and on until by the end of the day, after the gathering of relatives and a few friends had reached its zenith, we ate. Along with that came an ungodly amount of sodas and various desserts which varied by year or willingness to prepare. But this was for the holidays. Most Americans ate these foods to some degree, but during the other days of the year, when double shifts and tiredness got the best of her, I could count on even more dense, calorie-driven food. Food with flavor and succulence. Food that was not expected, nor did it have any intention of being healthy. Over the years, this became the norm, and to live without it seemed almost blasphemous. When she attempted to fill my plate with salad or whatever Oprah Winfrey deemed health conscious, I would go to bed either angry or hungry or both, yet confident in the fact that this was temporary, and whatever she was trying to do food-wise would soon give way to the reality that we were poor, and the one thing that poverty would never provide was options. Being the youngest of three, and born on the same day as my mother, gave me certain privileges. By the time I was 5 years old, my older brother and sister had both left the house, one by marriage, the other by way of the military, and with the house all to myself, my mother and I formed an impenetrable bond that we would solidify on our birthday. Each year, on our special day, she would awaken me with a prevenient smile, and like clockwork, we would sing happy birthday to one another. Her in soprano, me in prepubescent timbre. This was followed by her expressing her love for me, and I would reciprocate, knowing that within seconds I would be presented with whatever gift she could afford. This would range from toys that were the cheapest of the cheap to game consoles and the newest fashions. I never knew how she could afford these things, but the one thing that she always attributed it to was her faith in God and her practice of paying her tithes and offerings. For the uninitiated, paying a tenth of one's income was and is a mandate of anyone within the Christian faith. And being that my mother was what most would label as devout, this was a common practice, and to her, not doing so was a sin. Malachi chapter 3, verse 8 was the scripture she lived by. Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me in tithes and offerings. On one hand, I could see how the paying of tithes helped with the upkeep of the church and provisions for the sick and destitute, but the idea of robbing God was always comical to me. In my head, I kept picturing God opening his heavenly wallet to pay for a meal, only to notice that my mother's 10% was missing, followed by him sucking his teeth in disappointment. Not to mention, it was hardly a robbery. The thought of the creator of time, space, and the great beyond being strong-armed by my mother, who was no more than 150 pounds and every bit of 5'6", always gave me a private chuckle. But to her, this was of the utmost importance. To her, this was how we sustained ourselves, how she was able to afford those gifts and pay those bills and spring for holiday dinners. It was also a protection from illness and financial calamity. We moved around a lot. By the time I was a teenager, I had seen the wheat fields of Kansas, the cornfields of Illinois, and the dairy farms of Wisconsin. I had also waved goodbye to newfound friends on at least 10 or 11 occasions, each move resulting in us finding what seemed to be the best home she could afford and a church home to boot. Each neighborhood mirrored the last regarding economic status. In Wichita, alcoholic bikers taught me the harmonica on broken wooden porches. In Chicago, black men, strong and weak, taught me survival. And in Kenosha, I taught myself how to dream. With each neighborhood, danger and detriment existed in varying degrees, waiting to absorb me like grease on a paper towel. But there was always food, syrupy and processed, fried and candied, cheap and costly in the long run. Yet as long as there was a church to be found, some place where her soul and her 10% could find haven, we would be fine. She counted on this. It was the one sure thing in her life. The fruit of the Spirit was her buffet. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. She consumed and became a shining example of each. It radiated from her being like light through a prism, coloring our world with the promise of the hereafter, especially when the here and now seemed bleak. Coming home from school one afternoon, I turned the key to our apartment to find her seated on the floor, one knee in hand, holding the phone with the other. She was quiet, listening to every word that proceeded from the receiver, as if it were a secret or something only a whisper could contain. I sat on the couch and stared at her as her shoulders caved inward, followed by her head descending to her chest in an unforced surrender. When she hung up the phone, she turned to me, tears pooling within her lashes, and informed me that her mother had died. I feel as though it's necessary to call her her mother. To me, she was Grandma, the smiling lady who vaguely resembled my mother and fed me sugar cookies so sweet, so saccharine that my cheeks would tense. But she was her mother, her teacher, her saint. Not knowing exactly what to do, I joined her on the floor, held her quivering frame, and sat quietly as her head rested on my chubby shoulder. I had seen her cry, usually at church when the spirit was high. Those tears were dignified, grateful, pure. I had even heard her cry, at night in her room while she assumed I was asleep, but these tears were weighted, pained, full of memories and hardships, laughter and light that had existed way before my time. As I sat with her, cradling her within my short arms, trying to conjure any posture, pose, or purpose resembling masculinity, two thoughts held space in my mind. Hold her tight. And the second thought, louder and constant, would I ever feel this pain? I don't remember the funeral, but I have fleeting memories of the repast. Uncles, aunties, and cousins gathered and mournful, ingesting soul food while ignoring the irony of the term. From what I could comprehend, Grandma died of complications from diabetes and several strokes. To this day, I have no idea of the true sound of her voice. She had lost the ability to speak by the time I was 3. Slurred words and mumbles proceeded from her brown and cherubic face. That's all I ever knew. For years, I assumed this was simply the way she spoke until I learned about dysarthria and its effect on the afflicted. I was never sure if food was a factor in her death, but weeks later, after my mother purchased a Thigh Master and several cartons of Slim Fast took up the space in the cabinet once reserved for ginger snaps and jelly beans, I was pretty sure that diet held at least a modicum of the blame. By the time I was a teenager, my jeans had graduated from husky to baggy, and as luck would have it, thanks to hip-hop, it was in style. Our financial situation had taken a turn for the better. My mother became a nurse, working long hours and leaving me to fend for myself. Left to my own devices, I would eat whatever she prepared or whatever the refrigerator allowed. 2-inch cheeseburgers, frozen pizzas, hot dogs and pork and beans. Whatever would ease my loneliness and hold something that subconsciously represented her. My caloric caretakers were my calm when neighbors fought beneath me, my lullaby when she worked third shift, my good night and grand rising. By the age of 16, I too became a Christian, and like all of the converts around me, food became our altar, where we sacrificed the things of this world, including our health. After church, if fried chicken or fish dinners were not being sold, we would gather at restaurants or one another's apartments and fellowship. By fellowship, I mean eat, and by eat, I mean feast. But we didn't just fill our bellies with food and drink. We also filled our egos with certitude. We were the chosen, those set apart from the world and freed from the constraints of sin. And as our scriptural knowledge increased, so did our waistlines. Over time, our prayer requests shifted from favor on the job and wisdom during exams to laying hands over negative medical test results and swollen limbs. By the time I entered college, 2 things had transpired. My weight had ballooned to nearly 300 pounds, and my mother had become a type 2 diabetic. She had convinced me that this too would pass, that somehow she would persevere, and somehow, through the grace of God, I would grow out of my now fluffy frame. She was partially correct. I was still growing, and within months of surviving off ramen noodles and other struggle meals too numerous to name, I had returned home by Christmas, taller, slimmer, and to my surprise, handsome. Due to my newfound vanity, holiday meals needed to include veggies. The heaping bowls of chitlins and eating until comatose seemed silly if not harmful. The luster had been lost, and the words of Oscar Wilde reverberated in my mind on a loop. Do all things in moderation, even moderation. My mother, on the other hand, worsened. By the time I completed college, she had grown thin and weak. The whirl of ambulances and the pricking of fingertips became commonplace, and I had now become much more than a son. I had become her guardian, Our roles had reversed, and it became my duty to inspect the refrigerator for sodas and ice cream, to misplace candy bars and accidentally throw away bacon. I wasn't alone in this task. By now, my sister had completed culinary school, and armed with a new way of doing things, she would spend countless hours discussing healthy options and alternatives in an attempt to, at the very least, alter our mother's normal fare. My big sister put my militant mind at ease and assured me that no matter what happened, I had a life to live. And the decisions of our mother were just that, her decisions. Taking her advice, I moved cross-country, away from the dairy farms and wheat fields of the Midwest and into the mountainous landscapes of California. There was a lingering guilt that remained. Months before my departure, my mother had a health-related incident that forced her to move in with my sister. This wasn't all bad. In Chicago, she was surrounded by family, and my older brother was able to take his rightful place as an elder and help oversee her care. But weeks later, another incident, based on her worsening state, cornered us into placing her in a nursing home. The cyclical nature of it all was maddening. I remember the long drives my mother and I would take to visit her mother when she too became a resident. The cold acceptance of death and decisions, the caretakers too busy to truly care. Thankfully, this was not the case for my mother. The facility was small, with only a handful of residents. Lush greenery and attentive nurses were the norm, and even when I attempted to make surprise visits, I would often find my mother in her room surrounded by staff, listening to her regale them with tales of her faith, her childhood, and the murky men of her past. More importantly, she liked the food. It certainly wasn't the down-home cuisine she had been steeped in for 59 years of her life, but it was tolerable. With that in mind, the days and nights spent discovering California, as well as my sense of self, came without the guilt of abandonment, which I assumed would force me to return. Months later, when our birthday came around, I hurried home and waited patiently for her call. It always came during the night when she felt I'd probably be done doing whatever a young bachelor would be doing during the day. I made sure that I was alone, in a proper state of mind, and willing to talk for as long as she needed. Like clockwork, the phone rang. I answered full of vigor and love, eager to commence with our tradition of singing to one another. But when she spoke, there was a frailty to her voice I hadn't heard before. Her words seemed forced, painfully so, as if the very phone call taxed her body and mind. I tried to keep things jovial with a few jokes here and there, small talk about the 405 highway, my longing for Lou Malnati's pizza, and the possibility of Barack Obama becoming president. But minutes into the call, she interrupted me, saying she wasn't feeling very well, and we should go ahead and sing so she could rest. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. It was anything but happy. Hearing her struggle to hit each note, vowel, and syllable was a torture that increased by the second. There was no cadence to enjoy, no flourishes or laughter, just pained words pleading through a device. When we were done, and our tradition had met its yearly end, she paused and took a deep breath as though there were some warning, something which she needed to say. I waited patiently, believing some life-affirming mission would escape her lips, but all she could manage was a slow and sincere, I love you. As usual, I reciprocated and tried to crack a joke that didn't land, and the call came to an end. Alone and miles away from her, I stared at the wall and contemplated the inevitable. When would I get the call? The dreaded conversation that would drop me to my knees and lower my head in surrender. A week later, I received the call, and by the next day, I was in Chicago's Christ Medical Hospital, joined by my siblings, weeping over the only unconditional love we had ever known. Days later, after all of the arrangements had been made and the hollow disbelief of death had matured into acceptance, I arrived at the visitation much earlier than the proceedings were to begin. Standing before the coffin, looking down at her, the same dignified silence on her face still present and palpable, I couldn't help but wrestle with the thought. Food did this. The same meals that carried me through hard times and celebrations, gatherings and gluttony, had at the same time slowly walked my mother to her grave on the same sugar-soaked path as her mother before her. Needing more time to process the irony, I took a front row seat and sat with eyes closed as well-wishers began to trickle in. Minutes later, sitting there with my head held low, feeling the ground beneath me, an oddity occurred. A sound, familiar yet out of place, broke through the silence of my grief. Suspiciously, I opened my eyes to find a frog, no bigger than my palm, mere inches from my feet, croaking and bellowing before me as if it had a message to relay. I couldn't fathom how it wandered in. The cemetery grounds were home to an array of wild animals, but to have it here, at this moment, facing only me, felt uniquely strange. The type of strange that my mother and I would grunt and laugh at. The kind of strange that she would attribute to God and I would attribute to happenstance. It was our kind of strange. After a few puzzled chuckles, I picked up the frog and carried and released it outside among the wilderness, and re-entered the visitation just as the wake began to fill. Hours later, after the funeral had ended and friends and family gathered at yet another soul food-laden repast, an aunt revealed to me that the frog was a good omen, a sign of prosperity and rebirth, fertility and harmony. I accepted her interpretation, and days later, I was back in California, traversing through smog, ambition, and time, while doing all things in moderation. Years later, amid wrapping Christmas gifts and untangling a massive ball of holiday lights, my girlfriend entered our apartment with timid steps. Her supple sub-Saharan face was red and flush, the glow in her almond eyes dim and full of tears. "Have you checked your phone?" she asked, knowing I always kept it silenced. "No," I replied while searching for the device. She stayed silent, still, giving me time to find my phone and a moment that I was not looking for. When I did, 15 or so missed calls, all from Chicago, illuminated the screen. When I finally reached my sister's husband, his voice was trapped in a tremble, struggling to maintain its manly tone. He didn't say much, only that my sister had suffered an aneurysm and that it would be wise to get to Chicago as soon as possible. Searching for a sliver of hope, I asked him if I should wait. Maybe she would pull through, but before I could finish, he interrupted my denial and in no uncertain terms insisted that I come back home as soon as I possibly could. The next night, I landed at Chicago's O'Hare Airport. My older brother, sullen yet strong, embraced me, perhaps longer and tighter than he'd ever had, and advised me that we should head straight to the hospital. During the drive, we engaged in intermittent small talk. None of it I remember, but as we neared the hospital, I couldn't help but notice how familiar the neighborhood was. The streets and the buildings, although flickering with colorful Christmas lights and tassels, seemed like a mournful déjà vu. As we turned into the hospital campus, the familiarity I had felt so strongly struck me like a punch to the gut. Again, I was here at Christ Memorial Hospital, preparing to say goodbye, this time to another version of my mother. As we entered the building, I was met by extended family members, older than I remembered, yet still strong and resolute. My years of grinding in California had caused us to grow apart. The peaks and valleys of their lives were a mystery to me, and I felt like a stranger. Before I could wallow any further into self-pity, I was surrounded by smiles, hugs, compliments, and kisses on the cheek. In mere seconds, I found comfort in the truth that our familial bond had only been bent by time, but not broken. On the elevator, my brother and I stood in silence. Somehow, the higher we rose, the lower I sank. Sensing this, my brother placed his heavy hand on my shoulder and asked, "You okay?" As I opened my mouth to respond, the elevator chimed open, and I was greeted immediately by more family, more friends, and collective sorrow. As I attempted to stiffen my upper lip and straighten my back, my niece, now a preteen, emerged from the crowd. Walking towards me, teary-eyed and stuck in her own disbelief, I was struck by how strongly she resembled my sister. Not only the sister of my adulthood, but the younger her. The sister that kicked me out of her room and pinched my enormous ears when I worked her last nerve. Also the woman who gave me money for groceries when I was broke and spoke confidence into those same enormous ears. My niece was beautiful, ladylike, and highly intelligent. Another version of her mother. As I walked the hall, Big Brother by my side, headed towards the room that contained our sister, another irony befell me. Not only was I in the same hospital which 10 years prior housed the body of our mother, I was on the same floor. My sister in a coma no more than 20 feet and a decade away from the same pain that ravaged our hearts so many years ago. Shaking off this truth, I entered her room. Half-brothers and sisters from her father's side, beloved cousins and her husband by her side. Lying in the center of it all was our Sonny, motionless, silent, hooked to machines in our unwillingness to let go. Immediately, I went to her, kissed her on her head, and whispered words that will forever stay between us. Shortly after, a male nurse entered and checked her vitals under the watchful eyes of the group. Out of curiosity, I asked him if he could explain what happened. He could only speak from experience, but what he could say for certain was that her aneurysm was likely due to high blood pressure, stress, and other complications primarily caused by diet. In other words, food did this. We buried her 2 days before Christmas. At the repast, an assemblage of friends, family, and members of her church intermingled in a somber yet celebratory state. I learned that she was deeply loved within the congregation, a model parishioner and faithful tither, attending weekly Bible studies and church events, even using her culinary skills for fundraising and occasional meals for the pastor. In the dining area hall, the all too familiar scent of soul food wafted through the air like a ghost. When I entered, the usual assortment of Southern delicacies was splayed out among several large tables and a wall of stainless steel catering chafers. Minutes later, after all of my loved ones filled their plates and began to eat, an ineffable sadness related yet unrelated to the funeral descended upon me, and I refused to eat. Noticing that there was no plate before me, the pastor's wife approached and expressed that she understood and that soon they would begin dietary classes and workshops about healthy food alternatives for their members. Behind her, her husband, the pastor, entered the hall. In his nose, a tube connected to some discreet device snaked down his throat. As I scanned the room, full of generations of loved ones, a sudden sense of irony rose again. On one hand, there was a deep sense of joy in the room. All of these beautiful people, including myself, were the offspring of my grandmother. But on the other hand, here we all were, gathered at yet another repast, eating the same food that caused the funeral. Thank you again for joining me on the 15th episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. As always, you can reach me at swtomail@gmail.com. That is swtomail@gmail.com. As always, I appreciate all of you, all of my listeners, those abroad and those in the States. I don't really have much of a outro, basically, but I just would like to say, once again, I appreciate you all. I hope that you're getting something out of this. This is truly a labor of love. And as always, please be mindful of the stories you tell yourself.